I've never been a man who found safety in churches. They always felt temples of silence, designed to amplify the slightest whisper, the smallest creak of the floorboards, and the crushing weight of everything left unsaid. My back hurts. Every morning it hurts. But that's from the war, not from the wooden pews. I was at my station in the local museum, a converted Victorian police house, cataloging an old leather boot they'd found in a well when the vicar of St. Jude's came in. Father Michael. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles, bruised purple, hanging like weights from his eyelids. His face was a mask of sheer exhaustion. He didn't ask about the exhibits. He didn't offer a prayer. He just stood there, his massive hands, scarred from a life of farm work before the seminary, trembling on the glass counter. "I need your help," he said, his voice like two stones grinding together. It removed the communion wine. Again, the homeless sometimes sleep in the entryway. I started to say. Father Michael just shook his head. "No, the sanctuary doors are locked with the iron bolt, the old bolt." He leaned in closer, and when I opened them this morning, the air was freezing, colder than the crypt in December. Every chalice, every bottle was gone. Not on the floor, not in the trash, just gone. This wasn't just a simple haunting. St. Jude's was built in 1701, on the bones of a plague pit, or so the locals said. Every child knew the stories of the gray monk, of the silent choir, of the pews that would sometimes turn upside down overnight. But this felt different, personal. I agreed to come that night, at 11 p.m., just me, and the museum's infrared camera and an old, silver-edged crucifix I'd stolen from my own father's deathbed. I arrived as the old clock tower was striking the final note. The air was heavy, spice-scented, cloying with the smell of wet limestone and the dust of 1,000 prayers. The silence was a physical weight. I pushed the heavy, iron-studded oak doors open. They didn't scream. They surrendered. The sanctuary was vast, a cathedral of shadows. The moonlight filtered through the stained glass, casting broken patches of deep, bruised blue and arterial red across the marble floor. I walked down the central aisle. The air was indeed freezing. My breath huffed out in short, white bursts of mist. Suddenly, I stopped. A light was burning on the altar, not a candle, a small, electric, reading lamp sitting next to the tabernacle. Someone was there, a small, fragile figure, dressed in a blue hospital gown. It was a boy, not more than 10 years old. His back was to me, but I could see his ribs, prominent, translucent, through the thin fabric. "Hello," I whispered. The sound, amplified by the vast stone vault, seemed to bounce from wall to wall, echoing, like a question asked into a tomb. The boy didn't move. I took another step. The incense was choking now, the smell of burning beeswax and rotting vegetation. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice trembling. I reached out my hand. The boy, very slowly, very deliberately, turned his head. It wasn't a child's face. His face was a mantelpiece, flat, featureless, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a pale gray scab of skin where the human expression should have been. And from that pale scabbing, the low, rhythmic, hypnotic sound of someone humming. The humming didn't come from a throat. It vibrated through the very stones of the floor, a low, resonant thrubbing that made the marrow in my bones feel like it was turning to ice. I froze, my hand still extended in that stupid, useless gesture of comfort. The boy, or the thing in a hospital gown, didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze. It was a heavy, physical pressure against my chest, like a weight being slowly, steadily, increased until my ribs began to groan. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The featureless face tilted to the left. A slow, mechanical movement. The humming stopped. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an erasure. The ticking of the clock tower, the wind rattling the stained glass, the sound of my own frantic pulse. It all vanished. I was standing in a vacuum. Suddenly, the boy's hand moved. He reached up to that pale, gray scab of skin where his mouth should have been. His fingers were long, translucent, and ended in sharp, yellow points that looked more like talons than nails. He began to peel. It wasn't a fast movement. It was the slow, deliberate work of a master craftsman. I watched, paralyzed, as he dug those talons into the edge of his jaw and pulled upward. The sound of the skin tearing was like wet parchment being ripped, a soft, rhythmic shredding. Underneath the gray mask, there wasn't a face. There was a hole, a deep obsidian void that seemed to drink the moonlight from the air. And from that void, a thin, black, oily liquid began to leak. It dripped onto the marble altar, sizzling where it touched the sacred cloth. The smell hit me then. It wasn't just rot. It was the smell of a pharmacy, antiseptic formaldehyde, and that cloying, sweet scent of chloroform. The thing stepped toward me. Its feet didn't make a sound on the marble. It moved like a shadow, a smudge on the reality of the sanctuary. The whine, a voice whispered. It wasn't the boy's voice. It was 1,000 voices, overlapping a choir of the damned. The blood of the victims, stale. I backed away, my boots slipping on the cold stone. My hand went to the pocket of my coat, searching for the silver-edged crucifix. My fingers were numb. Fumbling, useless, I tripped over a kneeling stool. I hit the floor hard, the impact rattling my teeth. The museum's infrared camera flew from my hand, sliding across the aisle and coming to rest under a dark oak pew. The screen was still on, in the pale, green glow of the night vision. I saw the sanctuary, but it wasn't empty. The pews were full. Figures in white gowns, their faces covered in that same gray, scabbing skin, were sitting in rows. Hundreds of them. Their heads were all tilted to the left, their hands folded in a parody of prayer. And in the center of the aisle, right above me, was the boy. In the infrared, he wasn't child. He was a tower, a jagged, black pillar of smoke and needles, reaching all the way to the vaulted ceiling. His arms were dozens of long, thin, surgical probes twitching in the cold air. "We need a fresh donor," the choir whispered. One of the probes descended. It was thin, tipped with a diamond-sharp needle. It moved toward my neck, slow, inevitable. The architect needs marrow. The needle didn't sting. It vibrated, a high-pitched, microscopic hum that traveled through the layers of my skin, through the muscle, and anchored itself directly into the bone of my neck. My entire body went rigid, a sudden total paralysis that felt like my blood had been replaced with liquid lead. I couldn't even blink. Through the graining haze of the infrared camera on the floor, I watched the rows of faceless, gray figures in the pews. They didn't move, but their humming grew a deep, rhythmic throbbing that seemed to be timed with the pulsing of my own heart. Thump, hump, thump, hump. The vicar is a practical man. The choir of voices whispered from the void in the boy's face. I heard a heavy metallic clank at the back of the sanctuary. The iron bolt, the old 1701 iron bolt. Someone was sliding it into place. I strained my eyes, the only part of me that still obeyed my will. In the shadows of the narthex, I saw him, Father Michael. He wasn't shaking anymore. He wasn't exhausted. He was standing tall, his massive hands folded neatly over his chest. He looked at me, and then he looked at the tower of black needles looming over my body. The church must survive. Arthur, the vicar said. His voice was no longer a grind of stones. It was smooth, professional, and completely void. St. Jude's was never just a house of God. It was a sanatorium. He stepped forward into the moonlight. In 1840, the cholera didn't take the village. The doctors did. They found a way to preserve the essence of the suffering, to bottle the marrow of the dying. They called it the sacrament. The black probe in my neck began to draw. A cold, sucking sensation started deep in my spine. I felt my strength, my memories, my very weight being pulled upward through that diamond-sharp needle. The boy was the first. Father Michael murmured, his boots clicking on the marble as he walked toward the altar. Patient zero. He was bottled before he could even speak his own name. Now he is the chief collector. The architect's name echoed in my mind. The architect designed the system. The vicar continued, as if reading my thoughts. A global, spiritual infrastructure, a network of churches, hospitals, and museums, all harvesting the finest, marbling for the clients. The boy's featureless face leaned down, inches from mine. The void in his head was swirling, a black, oily galaxy of needles and surgical silk. I could smell the chloroform again, mixed with the sharp, acrid scent of ionized air. The museum was a mistake, the choir whispered. Too much. History. Not enough. Fresh. Meat. Father Michael reached into the pocket of his cassock and pulled out a small, heavy glass chalice. It wasn't filled with wine. It was filled with a thick, golden, amber brine. Drink, he commanded, leaning over my paralyzed form. It will make the extraction much cleaner. He pressed the rim of the glass against my lips. The liquid was boiling. The liquid didn't burn my lips. It infiltrated them. I felt that hot, salty, amber brine fill in my mouth, but I couldn't swallow. It moved of its own accord, sliding down my throat like molten wax, coating my vocal cords, turning my breath into a thick, spiced vapor. The taste was harrowing. Rosemary, iron, and something clinical. Old rubbing alcohol and 1,000 years of altar dust. The body is merely a vessel, Father Michael whispered. His face was inches from mine now, illuminated only by the dead, green glow of the infrared camera on the floor. We are simply purifying it for the architect. Suddenly, the walls of the church vanished. The stone became transparent, like thick, dirty glass. I no longer saw stained glass or oak pews. I saw the past. The sanctuary wasn't filled with parishioners. It was filled with beds, iron frames, rusted, creaking, lined up in infinite rows. People lay on them, alive, but their faces were sealed with that same gray, scabbing skin. Doctors in long, leather aprons moved between them. They weren't healing. They were draining. Every patient had a long, silver tube inserted into their spine. It vibrated, just like the needle in my neck was vibrating now. The fluid coming out of them was golden. This is the essence. The choir of voices in the boy's head grew louder, turning into a deafening resonance. Pain converted into preservative. I felt my fingers beginning to harden. It wasn't a paralysis of the muscles. It was something worse. My skin was becoming ceramic, smooth, cold, and absolutely white. I watched as my veins pulsed beneath my translucent hand, but they weren't blue anymore. They were filling with amber. Look at them. Father Michael pointed to the figures in the pews. They began to stand, slowly, in perfect, rhythmic synchronicity. In the moonlight, I saw that their hospital gowns weren't fabric. They were bandages, soaked in this same resin. They had no names. They were the harvest of 1840, and they were waiting for a fresh addition. The architect needs a curator for the museum, the boy whispered, and his black void of face suddenly expanded. I felt the needle in my neck begin to rotate. It wasn't just pulling my mind out. It was replacing my thoughts with its own. I saw blueprints. Thousands of churches across the globe connected by underground pipelines. Vast vats beneath the Vatican, beneath Notre Dame, beneath small village chapels. All religion was just a facade for a global system of conservation. You will become a display. Father Michael pulled a long surgical scalpel from behind the altar. He didn't intend to kill me. He intended to open. We will exhibit you in your own museum, in the display case meant for Victorian boots. People will look at your perfect marble skin and never guess that you're still there inside, marinating. The blade touched my chest. I didn't feel pain. I felt ice. The cold was a silent erasure as the scalpel moved. I didn't see blood. I saw amber, mist. The brine had already replaced my hemoglobin, my plasma, my very life force. The vicar's hands were steady. He wasn't cutting like a murderer. He was cutting like Taylor. The museum was always the indie point, Father Michael murmured, his voice vibrating through the ceramic shell of my chest. All those artifacts, the boots, the rusted tools, the locks of hair, did you really think they were history? He peeled back a layer of my skin. It didn't flap. It cracked like a thin sheet of ice. They are bait, he whispered. Suddenly, my mind flashed back to the museum, to the old leather boot I'd been cataloging just hours ago. I remembered the weight of it, the way the leather felt, supple, almost warm. In my mind's eye, I saw the boot again, but this time, I saw the stamp on the inner sole, property of St. Jude Sanatorium, 1840. The boot wasn't an artifact. It was a lead, a trail left by the architect to find those who were compatible, those whose curiosity would lead them directly into the brine. You have excellent marbling. The choir of voices in the boy's head hissed. The tower of black needles above me began to contract. The surgical probes withdrew from my neck, but they left something behind. A small silver receiver embedded in my vertebrae. I could feel it, a tiny, rhythmic ticking that was synchronized with the underground pipelines. I was no longer an individual. I was a node. Wait. I tried to scream, but my voice was a dry, rattling whistle. The vicar stopped. He looked at my face, his eyes narrowing. The specimen is rejecting the sedative, he noted, his voice clinical, cold. I looked at my right hand, the one that was still holding the silver-edged crucifix in my pocket. The brine couldn't penetrate the silver. Where the metal touched my palm, the skin was still pink, still soft, still human. It was a small, jagged island of meat in a sea of porcelain. I channeled every ounce of my fading, organic, will into that hand. I felt the muscles groan, the amber-filled veins straining against the ceramic shell of my arm. Crack. A hairline fracture appeared at my wrist. Crack. The white, marble-like skin of my forearm began to splinter. The impurity. The boys' choir shrieked, a sound that shattered the stained glass of the east window. The metal is infecting the batch. Father Michael lunged for my arm, his face twisting into a mask of pure, bureaucratic rage. You are spoiling The inventory. I didn't let go. I drove the silver crucifix upward. Not at the vicar, but at the boy. At the void. If he was the chief collector, if he was the valve for the entire church's system, then he was the weak point. The silver touched the black, oily galaxy in his face. The reaction was violent. The silver didn't just cut, it triggered. The moment the crucifix touched the obsidian void in the boy's face, the sanctuary didn't scream. It inhaled a massive gravitational tull, started from the very center of the altar. The air, the moonlight, the scent of the incense, everything began to be sucked into that black, oily hole. I felt my boots slide across the marble. The friction of rubber against stone was a long, dry grind. It was the only sensation left in the vacuum. I gripped the edge of a heavy oak. Phew. My fingers dug into the wood until the splinters pierced my skin. But the wood was no longer wood. Under my touch, the oak felt warm. It pulsed. I looked down and saw a thin blue vein throbbing beneath the varnish. The repair sequence is active. The choir of voices whispered in my head. It was no longer a hum. It was a rattle of gears. The entire church began to transform. The stone pillars started to rotate, slow, heavy, relentless. I watched as the floorboards in the center of the aisle opened like a throat. Below the church, there wasn't a crypt. There was a valve, a massive, 3-story high, biological pump. It was made of the same translucent, amber glass as the jars, but it was alive. I could see the liquid moving inside, a dark golden, thick river of the essence they had stolen from the village since 1701. The marrow must flow. Father Michael was no longer a man. He was being integrated. The stone wall behind the altar had split apart, and long silver tendrils were emerging from the masonry. They wrapped around the vicar's arms, his legs, his neck. They weren't strangling him. They were plugging in. I saw a silver tube slide into the base of his skull. His eyes didn't roll back. They illuminated. A bright, amber glow filled his sockets, the same light I'd seen in the jars. The clients are thirsty, Father Michael said, but his voice was now part of the machine. I felt a sharp cold sting in my own spine. One of the tendrils had found me. It was thin, as fine as a hair, but it carried the weight of a mountain. I felt a sudden, overwhelming nausea as the brine was injected directly in my nervous system. The world flipped. I wasn't standing on the floor anymore. I was floating. The gravity in the sanctuary had been reversed. I looked up and saw the vaulted ceiling opening like a flower, but instead of stars, I saw the pipelines, thousands of silver glass tubes stretching out from St. Jude's like a web. They went through the earth, through the foundations of the houses, through the walls of the museum. I saw my own office. I saw my desk. I saw the jar I'd left there. Everything is connected. The architect, the tendril in my neck began to pull. I wasn't being killed. I was being recalled. I was being dragged toward the pump, toward the heart of the sanctuary. The pull wasn't a jerk. It was a steady, hydraulic drag. I hung suspended, a broken marionette in a cathedral of flesh and glass. The silver tendril on my neck hummed with a frequency that made my teeth vibrate inside my gums. My vision began to strobe. 1 second, the sanctuary was a ruin of stone. The next, it was a throating organism, slick with golden medicinal slime. The pump must equalize Father Michael's voice boomed. He was no longer a man in a cassock. He was a pillar of veins. The stone wall had swallowed him up to his chest, and the silver tubes were pumping rhythmic, heavy, wet pulses of amber through his throat. Below my dangling boots, the mouth of the silica cylinder loomed. It was 20 feet wide, a whirlpool of collected essence. I could see things floating in the deep, golden thickness, not just jars. I saw faces, preserved, translucent, floating like jellyfish in a sea of honey. They weren't dead. Their eyes were tracking my descent. They were the vintages, the harvest of 1840, 1780, 1701. The history is flavor. The choir of voices hissed. I was 10 feet from the surface of the brine. The heat coming off the cylinder was caustic. It smelled of burnt clothes and ozone. I felt the hair on my arms scorch my skin. The raw, red, human skin began to tighten. The brine in the air was plasticizing. It was turning my clothes into a hard shell. My jacket felt like ceramic. My trousers were brittle. If I hit that pool, I wouldn't drown. I would set. I looked up at the tendril. It was thin, shimmering, and pulsed with a pale blue light. I didn't try to cut it. I knew the silver-edged crucifix would only conduct the architect's power. Instead, I reached into my other pocket. The old lock of hair. The one I'd taken from a museum's sanatorium exhibit. It was a dry, brittle fragment of a girl who had died in 1842. It was a contaminant. The marbling must be pure. The architect's voice groaned through the receiver in my spine. I shoved the lock of hair into the entry point where the silver tendril met my neck. The reaction was violent. The machine didn't recognize the DNA. It was ancient. It was expired. The silver tendril shuddered. The blue light turned to sickly vomit. Green. Spark. Spark. Crackle. The frequency in my teeth shattered. My molars cracked from the sudden high voltage discharge. The tendril snapped. I didn't fall. I plummeted. I hit the surface of the amber brine with a thud that should have broken my ribs. The liquid wasn't wet. It was dense. It felt like falling into a pool of liquid glass. I sank deep into the golden silence. The descent didn't stop at the surface. It thickened. The amber brine was a heavy, viscous pressure that squeezed the air from my lungs before I could even scream. It didn't feel like drowning in water. It felt like being encased in warm sap. My eyes were wide open, but the world was a blurred, golden hue. I drifted downward, past the floating vintages. The faces of 1701 weren't just skin. They were pages. As I brushed past a woman in a tattered linen shroud, her memories leaped into my mind. I saw the plague. I saw the black, swollen bodes being tossed into the pit. I felt her fear, not as a thought, but as a taste. Bitter, metallic, sulfur. The marbling is experience. The architect's voice echoed, but it wasn't coming from the receiver anymore. It was coming from the liquid itself. Every drop of the brine was a data bit, a sensory record. The bottom of the silica cylinder wasn't stone. It was silver, a massive, circular motherboard made of polished surgical steel. Thousands of glass jars were plugged directly into the floor, their silver caps sparking with a low, rhythmic, electrical arc. And in the center of the floor sat the librarian. He wasn't a giant. He wasn't a monster. He was a shriveled, old man sitting in a wheelchair made of human bone. His skin was so thin it was translucent. I could see the golden amber, brine, flowing through his carotid arteries. He didn't have eyes. He had two small gold compasses embedded in his sockets. The needles in his eyes were spinning. He held a long, thin, silver stylus in a hand that was nothing more than knotted veins. He was writing. He was scratching symbols into the surface of a spoiled specimen, a man who had been flattened and dried like a piece of parchment. The museum curator has arrived, the librarian whispered. The sound didn't travel through the brine. It traveled through my teeth. I tried to move my arms, but the brine was setting. The reaction to the lock of hair, contaminant, was causing the liquid around me to crystallize. I was being turned into a statue in the middle of the architect's vault. The client in Paris wanted defiance. The librarian croaked. He didn't look up from his parchment. He paid for the struggle. I felt a sudden, sharp R.I.P. in my mind. The librarian was editing me. He moved his silver stylus in the air, and I felt a memory vanish. My mother's face, gone. The smell of the ocean, gone. The sound of my own name, gone. He was stripping the meat from my soul to make the marbling more concentrated. A pure specimen has no baggage. The voices hissed in perfect, rhythmic unison. I reached for the silver-edged crucifix. It was buried deep in my pocket, under a layer of hardening amber. My fingers were stiff. They felt like chalk. If I didn't strike now, I wouldn't just die. I would be fiction. The librarian didn't look at me. He didn't have to. He was feeling the texture of my consciousness through the silver stylus. Every time the metal point twitched, a piece of my essence was scraped away. First, the name of the street I grew up on, scraped. Then, the weight of my first loss, scraped. The amber brine around my body wasn't just hardening, it was absorbing. It was taking the memories the librarian discarded and filtering them into the golden sea. The pulp is uniform, the librarian whispered. His voice was a dry, rhythmic rattle, like dead leaves blowing across a tombstone. I felt a sudden, hollow vacuum in my chest. He was reaching for the core. He wanted the will to live. The silver stylus began to move in a slow, circular, hypnotic pattern in the brine. I could feel my heart rate slower. Thump, hump, thump, hump. My fingers were no longer fingers. They were chalk probes. The amber had turned the skin of my hand into a brittle, white glaze. If I moved, I would crack. But the silver-edged crucifix was still there, deep in the pocket of my plasticized jacket. It wasn't just a religious icon. It was a singularity. The silver was the only thing in the entire infrastructure that the brine couldn't collect. It was the genuine specimen. I focused on the one memory the librarian hadn't found yet. The pain, not the psychological pain, not the grief, the physical agony of my back, the war injury, the metal shrapnel still buried near my spine. It wasn't a memory. It was a constant current. I fed the librarian the shrapnel. I pushed the sensation of the jagged steel scraping against my vertebrae directly into the stylus. The marbling is jagged. The librarian shrieked. The silver needles in his eyes began to spin, reverse, whir, clack. The gold compasses in his sockets fractured. A spray of black, oily ink erupted from his eyes, mixing with the amber brine. The feedback was instantaneous. The librarian's wheelchair bone shattered. I felt the pressure in the brine drop. The crystallization halted. My hand, the one that was chalk, moved I didn't grab the crucifix. I grabbed the librarian's stylus. It was freezing. It was vibrating. It wasn't a tool for writing. It was a deletion key. I drove the silver point into the motherboard of the floor. System error. The choir of voices screamed. The collection is unlisted. The silver tubes in the floor began to melt. The black ink from the librarian's eyes was infecting the amber. The golden brine was turning void, black. The clients are leaking. I looked up. The silica cylinder above me was cracking. The weight of the history of 1701 was coming down. The floor didn't just crack, it decompressed. The silver motherboard beneath my feet, the one that served as the nervous system for the entire regional collection, began to buckle. The glass jars plugged into the floor didn't break. They imploded, one by one, a rhythmic metallic crunch, snap, pop, crackle. The amber brine was no longer gold. The black ink from the librarian's eyes had catalyzed. It was a neutralizer, a dark, oily void that was eating the preserved memories, the spices, the rosemary, the very essence of the stolen lives. The inventory is null. The choir of voices wailed. The sound was thin now, like a radio signal fading into static. The librarian didn't move. His shriveled, translucent shell was being absorbed into the silver floor. His bone wheelchair was a pile of powder, but his stylus, the one I still gripped in my chalk-white hand, was burning. The silver point was conducting the feedback from the entire global network. I saw them then, through the silver stylus. I saw the clients, the man in London, holding a crystal glass of golden brine, watched as the liquid in his hand turned obsidian. He screamed as the black oil leaped from the glass and into his pores. The woman in Tokyo, receiving her treatment from a silver needle, felt her marbling turn into ash. The architect's system was backfiring. The contract is breached. The architect's voice groaned, but it wasn't coming from the machine. It was coming from the styled parchment on the floor, the specimen the librarian had been editing, the man who'd been flattened. The parchment rose. It wasn't a man. It was a blueprint, a two-dimensional, flickering ghost of a human being. It had no depth, no thickness. It was a sheet of pure data. It drifted toward me, its edges as sharp as razors. You have erased value. The blueprint whispered. The sound was like paper tearing. I backed away, my boots slipping on the black, necrotic sludge. The silica cylinder above me was groaning. The weight of the 3 stories of brine was held up by a single, fractured ring of glass. I looked at the silver stylus. I looked at the blueprint. If the architect was just data, if he was just the organization of the suffering, then he couldn't be killed. He could only be rewritten. I drove the silver stylus into my own palm. The pain was a white-hot explosion in my brain. The silver point hit the chalk of my hand and shattered it. I didn't scream. I projected. I fed the architect the truth, not the preserved version, not the marbled version. I fed him the filth, the smell of the plague pit in 1701. Without the rosemary, the sound of the collar awards, without the hymns, the raw, unpreserved ugliness of a death that wasn't bottled. The blueprint shuddered. The lines of its body began to blur. The sharp edges curled. This content is unselect. The architect shrieked. The silica cylinder burst. The silica cylinder didn't just break. It surrendered. The 3 stories of amber brine, now poisoned by the black, necrotic ink of the librarian, came down with the weight of a collapsing mountain. I didn't hear a splash. I heard a crunch, the sound of the silver motherboard being crushed into the earth by the sheer hydraulic mass of the liquid. I was swept away. I wasn't swimming. I was debris. The black amber flood carried me through the floor of the crypt into a dark, jagged orophagus of tunnels that the church had hidden for centuries. These weren't built with brick or stone. They were extruded. They were made of a hard, calcified bone resin that looked like the interior of a massive, fossilized artery. I tumbled through the dark, my lungs burning, for air that wasn't saturated with the scent of cloves and ancient sweat. The flow is directionless. 1,000 distorted voices gurgled in the brine around me. I struck a protruding RIB of the tunnel. Snap! The sound of my own collarbone breaking was a dull thud, muffled by the density of the liquid. I didn't feel the pain. Not yet. The brine was a numbing agent. It was trying to fix me even as it destroyed me. I was washed into a reservoir, a vast subterranean cathedral of jars. It was larger than the church above. Miles of shelving, carved directly into the living, pulsing rock. Millions of jars. Some were as small as thimbles, containing a single tear. Others were as large as bats, containing entire skeletons, suspended in a perpetual golden convulsion. The black brine I had brought with me began to contaminate the reservoir. The darkness spread like a cancer through the shelves. I watched as the golden light in the jars flickered and died. The marbling of the souls inside began to unravel. The perfect, preserved smiles of the 1840 victims rotated into screams. You have broken the shelf life. The voice didn't come from the brine. It came from a booth at the far end of the reservoir, sitting behind a desk made of reinforced glass was a figure. It wasn't the librarian. It wasn't the blueprint. It was me, a perfect porcelain duplicate. It wore my clothes. It had my scars. It even held a silver-edged crucifix in its polished hand, but its eyes were hollow, too empty, sockets that were currently being filled with a black, oily feedback from the surface. The true architect, he wasn't a man. He was the template. I am what could have been. The duplicate whispered. Its voice was my own, but equalized. No emotion, no breath, no stutter. A stable record, a permanent history. The duplicate stood up. Its movements were fluid. It didn't have the shrapnel in its spine. It didn't have the pain in its back. It was a version of me that had been optimized for the collection. The clients want consistency, the duplicate said, stepping out from behind the glass desk. Its boots made a sharp clack on the bone resin floor. And you are chaos. It reached out a hand. Its fingers were long, thin, and tipped with diamond needles. The duplicate didn't move like a man. It moved like animation. Every step was a perfect geometric calculation. Its porcelain skin didn't wrinkle at the joints. It slid. It was the version of me that the architect had been refining in the dark for years. A version without the limp. A version without the shrapnel. The symmetry is recoverable. My own voice echoed from the duplicate's hollow chest. It reached for my throat with those diamond needles. I tried to raise my arm. of the broken collarbone, screamed. The pain was a jagged, white-hot interruption in the golden atmosphere of the reservoir. The duplicate flinched. Its perfect marble face developed a tiny, microscopic hairline fracture across the bridge of the nose. The signal is noisy, the duplicate whispered, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. I realized then, the duplicate wasn't just a copy. It was a receiver. It was tuned to the frequency of my Bejo data. Every time I felt agony, the perfect image of me stuttered. The architect couldn't process asymmetry. You want consistency. I wheezed, my breath rattling through the black brine in my lungs. I didn't try to heal. I didn't try to stay stable. I leaned into the destruction. I grabbed the duplicate's wrist, not with my good hand, but with the one that was chalk white and shattered. I ground the broken shards of my own fingers into its diamond tips. The sound was like diamonds on a chalkboard. Scree, the duplicate's eyes, the empty, hollow sockets began to bleed amber. The resolution is dropping. The choir of voices shrieked from the shelves of jars. I drove my forehead into the duplicate's face. I didn't feel the impact as a blow. I felt it as a collision of histories. I fed at the real 1840, not the marbled version in the jars, not the spiced rosemary lies. I fed at the smell of the unwashed bandages, the sound of the flies in the summer heat of the ward, the terror of the patient who knew the silver tube was coming and had no prayer left to say. The duplicate's skin began to peel. It didn't slough off like flesh. It flaked like old dry paint. The frame rate is failing. Beneath the porcelain, there was nothing but gray vapor. I didn't stop. I reached for the shrapnel in my own spine, the jagged, rusted, war metal that the librarian had tried to edit out. I focused all my rejection into that one piece of imperfection. I wasn't a specimen. I was a mistake. I am the rust in your machine. I roared. I slammed my back against the glass desk of the architect, driving the shrapnel point of my existence into the central terminal. The glass didn't break. It stained. A deep, rusted, brown oxidation began to spread from my spine into the reservoir. The architect's template began to wither. The rust didn't just spread. It infected from the point where my spine, my jagged, shrapnel-riddled reality pressed against the architect's glass terminal. A deep, corroded, brown plague began to sprint through the silver pipelines. It wasn't a liquid. It was a reaction. The perfect, sterilized world of the brine was meeting its antithesis, the slow, oxygen-fed decay of the natural world. I felt the recoil through the silver stylus still fused to my hand. I wasn't just in the reservoir anymore. I was the signal. I saw the Vatican terminal deep beneath the catacombs. A cardinal in robes of amber silk stood before a wall of golden jars. He was reaching for vintage from 1452, the essence of a martyr's stolen bravado. As his fingers touched the glass, the gold turned. The liquid inside didn't just darken, it boiled with rust. The jar cracked. The cardinal screamed as the martyr's essence became rusty shards that embedded themselves in his expensive skin. The preservation is expired. The choir of voices shrieked. now a distorted, static-filled wail. I saw the New York hub in a penthouse overlooking the park. A man with porcelain implants in his jaw felt his own face. Flake, the architect's upgrade, was failing. The amber brine that held his features in a state of permanent youth was being replaced by oxidation. His jaw crumbled into a pile of gray dust. On his mahogany desk, the clients are disconnecting. I felt the duplicate that optimized me shudder in the reservoir. Its marble chest was caving in. The perfect symmetry was being eaten by pits of corrosion. It looked like an ancient statue pulled from a sulfur pit. You have spoiled the future, the duplicate wheezed. Its voice was now a hiss of escaping gas. There is no future in a jar. I roared. I didn't pull away. I pushed harder. I fed the network the memory of my scars, the way they itched in the rain, the way they ached when I was tired. I fed the architect the wear and tear of a life that was actually lived. The silver tubes in the walls began to flop. They were losing their rigidity. The pressure that had held the sanctuary together for 3 centuries was dropping. Above us, the Church of St. Jude's began to moan. It wasn't a spiritual sound. It was the sound of unsupported stone. Without the hydraulic pressure of the amber brine, the biomechanical church was just a hollow shell. The architecture is falling. The ceiling of the reservoir, the massive, pulsing, bone resin sky started to flake. Chunks of calcified history, the size of cars, began to plummet into the black, rusty sludge. The bone resin ceiling didn't just fall, it pulverized. The massive, calcified ribs that had held the reservoir's weight for 3 centuries were now brittle, without the constant internal pressure of the amber brine to keep them supple. The organic architecture was shattering. Huge slabs of white, ivory-like stone, thundered into the black, rusty sludge around me. Crunch, splash, roar. I was knee-deep in the necrotic waste of the architect's failed collection. The liquid was no longer gold. It was a thick, gray SH mixed with the black ink of the librarian. It smelled of extinguished candles and damp earth. The foundation is hollow. The choir of voices whispered, now reduced to a single, skipping stutter. The city above, the museum, the rows of Victorian houses, they weren't built on soil. They were built on the scaffolding of the pipelines. I felt a vacuum as the silver tubes across the globe shrank and oxidized into dust they left behind. Voids, massive, miles long, caverns where the essence used to flow. Through the silver stylus, I heard the city scream. In the museum square, the cobblestones vibrated, then vanished. A sinkhole the size of a city block opened. The gray monk display, the wing of 1880s textiles, and the Victorian boot collection all tumbled into the dark. They weren't falling into a hole. They were being reclaimed by the gravity of their own lies. You have emptied the world. My duplicate croaked. It was lying on the floor of the reservoir, its porcelain skin spiderwebbed with cracks. Its limbs were detaching. One of its diamond-tipped hands lay in the sludge like a broken toy. I ignored it. I looked for the ascent. The central pump, the silica cylinder, was a jagged stump, but the internal ladder of silver rungs that the doctors had used to maintain the glass was still attached to the pulsing artery, wall. I began to climb. My broken collarbone, grinded. My fingers still coated in that. Chalk white, glaze, cracked with every grip. Snap, click, snap. I wasn't climbing a ladder. I was climbing a scab. The walls of the tunnel were contracting. The biomechanical organism was in throes. It was trying to crush the intruder before it died. The recall is total. The architect's voice boomed, but it was a death rattle. I saw the light of the surface. It wasn't the green glow of the infrared cameras. It wasn't the amber light of the jars. It was gray, the cold, indifferent light of a misty morning. The sanctuary of St. Jude's was splitting in two. The central aisle had become a chasm. I saw the pews, the ones with the pulsing veins, withering in a dry gray husks. The 1840 patients were no longer leaking. They were blowing away as fine powder. I reached the top of the stump. I looked back down into the reservoir one last time. The true architect, the duplicate of me, was gone. There was only a stain on the silver floor. I lunged for the marble floor of the church, my fingers catching on the edge of the altar. The altar wasn't marble anymore. It was chalk. As I hauled my broken, brine-soaked body onto the floor of the nave, the stone crumbled under my weight. The sacred architecture was de-densifying. The massive granite pillars that had supported the vaulted ceiling for 3 centuries were turning into pumice, light, porous, and gray. The gravity in St. Jude's was failing. I watched as a prayer book, soaked in the black, necrotic ink of the librarian, lifted off a pew and drifted toward the ceiling. It wasn't flying. It was dissolving into its component molecules. The record is fragile. The choir of voices whispered one last time. It wasn't a choir anymore. It was a single, weak signal. I looked at my hands. The chalk white glaze was falling off in long, thin scales. Beneath it, my skin was translucent. I could see my bones, my veins, my nerves, but they weren't blue or red. They were silver. The architect's upgrade hadn't been fully purged. It had stabilized. I wasn't a specimen anymore. I was the archive. I turned my head toward the main doors, the great oak portals, the ones Father Michael had bolted with his mantle or weaving. The wood was turning back into mist. Beyond the doors, the city was changing. The museum square was a maelstrom of gray dust. The Victorian houses were folding into the earth. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a subsidence. The pipelines that had served as the city's skeleton were gone, and the surface was settling. I saw the museum, my life's work, vanish. The gray monk wing, the 1880s textiles, the glass cases of hair combs, they all spiraled down into the center of the crater. Everything is returned to the earth. I whispered. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded like thousands. The memories I had eaten in a reservoir, the 1701 plague victims, the 1840 cholera patients, the 1920 factory workers, they were all stationed in my mind. I wasn't the curator of the museum anymore. I was the museum. I stepped out onto the square. The ground beneath my boots felt vibrant. I could feel the remaining tubes, the tiny capillaries that still reached toward the other cities. Paris, London, New York. The clients were hungry. They had lost their supply, and they knew where the source was. The architect never forgets. The wind hissed through the empty square. I looked at the silver-edged crucifix in my pocket. It was no longer silver. It was amber. The metal had finally succumbed. I was the only remaining record of the sanctuary, and the network was rebooting.